Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Pratik and I'll be taking up the News Today discussion for 7th May. So in the first news, we have India and Vietnam has upgraded their bilateral relationship. The second news is on the structural deficiencies in India's healthcare system. Third news is about NCRB releasing its Crime in India 2024 report. And in the fourth news, we'll be covering EACPM paper proposes overhaul of India's priority sector lending framework. Then we also have certain quick updates, and in the place in news, we'll be covering Algeria. So let us start with the very first news, that is India and Vietnam has recently upgraded their nature of their bilateral relationship. And this change has happened with the arrival of or the visit of the president of Vietnam to India. So this topic is part of GS paper 2 international relations. And here a couple of important developments have happened. So first you should understand what changes have happened. So as of now, the nature of relationship has been termed as enhanced comprehensive strategic partnership, right? But this did not start in vacuum. The concept or the India-Vietnam became strategic partner in 2007. Then in 2016, they became comprehensive strategic partners. And in 2026, that is today itself, they have declared this relationship, or yesterday itself, they have declared that their relationship has now become enhanced strategic or enhanced comprehensive strategic partnership. So this is not just a change in the terminologies. This indicates the broadening and deepening of India-Vietnam bilateral relation. Okay, so what has happened here is that India and Vietnam has now moved from what is called as 3C framework to the 3S framework. So what exactly is 3C framework and what is 3S framework? C here stands for commerce, capacity building, and connectivity. This has now changed, not changed as such, but it has now developed. So which means that the current framework will remain, but on top of that, we are now building the 3S framework, which is about security, which is about supply chain resilience, and also it is about, the other S is about sustainability. So you can see here that now India and Vietnam are cooperating not just in commercial realm, but and the capacity building and connectivity, but they have now moved much beyond that, and now they are cooperating in security in the new areas like supply chain, infrastructure or resilience, and in terms of environmental protection or sustainability, right? So this has been the nature of change. Now there are a couple of agreements that have been signed. So let us take a look into the key agreements that have been signed as part of this elevation of bilateral ties. And then we'll look into what exactly is the significance of Vietnam for India's foreign policy. So let's take a look at this key highlights. So first thing is that, see, commercial relation is basically the most foundational aspect of any bilateral ties. So in order to further deepen the ties, now the target has been set that by 2030, India and Vietnam will take their bilateral trade relations. Target has been set at $25 billion by 2030. And as of now, the number is around 16 billion, 16. So presently it is $16 billion. Now, you should also understand that India has an FTA with the ASEAN region, and Vietnam is the founding member, not the founding member, but Vietnam is one of the key members of ASEAN. Okay, so the AITIGA, that is ASEAN India Trade in Goods Agreement, has been signed, but largely India is not satisfied with the agreement because it has in a way created a lot of trade deficit for India. Okay, so India is now trying to negotiate this treaty, and also India is trying to include the services sector as also part of the trade agreement. Okay, so with this early review and conclusion of the AITIGA, it is going to further boost India-Vietnam trade relation. The second important development is that 13 strategic MOUs have been signed, and this include critical minerals cooperation, digital connectivity and fintech, healthcare, digitization of ancient Cham manuscripts, etc. This is to enhance that. This was going to broaden the entire area of cooperation. So you can see here that there are various areas of cooperation, not just digital partnership, but also development in terms of cultural relation. Then there is importance with respect to defense and security cooperation, where the both countries will develop strategic diplomacy in terms of defense dialogue. 2+2 dialogues will be set here. Then maritime integration, where Vietnam has agreed to join Indian initiative, that is Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative of 2019. Okay, so Indo-Pacific Initiative essentially is about seeking a free, open, and rule-based Indo-Pacific, right, where the rule of law will be applicable and not rule of muscle. Okay, so this initiative was part of India's venture in 2019 in the East Asian Summit. Okay, so these are some of the major developments with respect to the present visit of the Vietnamese president in India. Now let us take a look into the reasons why Vietnam is important for India. See, we all know that India has launched this Act East policy. Act East policy essentially is about improving India's ties with the eastern neighbors or the Southeast Asian nations, right? So that was part of the Look East policy. But now with Act East policy, the emphasis is on implementation, and the emphasis is also on the geographical expansion of the region. So earlier, while the Look East policy was largely concentrated on the Southeast Asian nation, the Act East policy is also concentrated on the entire Indo-Pacific countries. Moreover, the areas of cooperation has also moved away from commercial ties to strategic ties as well. So Vietnam here becomes a very critical part of India's Act East policy. Apart from that, Vietnam is also important for India's Mahasagar initiative, that is mutual and holistic security and growth for all in the region, especially in the Indo-Pacific or in this region, right? So this becomes very important. Then Vietnam has a very important geostrategic location. You can see this location here, where Vietnam has borders with China, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia. So it is very important neighbor, and it is also has the maritime neighbor with China, right? So you can see that Gulf of Tonkin, and it is also part of South China Sea. And in this area, China has constructed what is called as 9 dash lines, whereby China is claiming territories of different countries, including Vietnam. That is why this part or Vietnam's location here is very important, because it is essential for India. Now, we know that China is encircling India through a policy called as string of pearls, an unofficial policy, right? So as a response to that, India is also reaching out to Chinese neighbor, and Vietnam becomes a very important pillar of that policy. And that policy is known as Necklace of Diamond. So geostrategic location within the South China Sea. Then we have discussed countering China. So China has, as we discussed, this string of pearls, where China has constructed various ports near India's neighbor, right? And China is also encircling India from various sides. So Vietnam will also become a counter response of India's strategy, okay? Then supply chain diversification. We know that there's a strategy of +1, China +1, where the supply chain essentially will be provided by not just China, but different countries. And Vietnam has become a very important part of global value chain. And India also wants to be part of that global value chain because this has potential to boost India's manufacturing. It has potential to create high value employment in India. So by aligning with Vietnam, India can be part of the global value chain. Next, Vietnam also provides huge areas of energy security. In fact, several of Indian private sector and Indian public or PSUs are part of the oil exploration and development of Vietnam, various sectors like oil and gas, right? So ONGC Videsh is present in Vietnam, in the South China Sea. So these are the various reasons why Vietnam is important for India. And we have also discussed what the changes in the relationship has happened, what are the various areas of cooperation. Okay. Now from this topic, UPSC can ask you a broad question in terms of discuss the significance of Vietnam, or they can ask you a question with respect to the recent changes in the relationship or the recent elevation of the bilateral ties, how we are using or what kind of changes have happened in terms of India-Vietnam relation. So from this topic, UPSC had asked a previous year question from prelims here like this. So consider the following statement. Vietnam has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world, correct? Vietnam is led by a multi-party political system? No. Vietnam is largely a communist. It still has Communist Party as the dominant player, so it doesn't have a multi-party system. Vietnam's economic growth is linked to its integration with global supply chain and focus on exports. This is correct. In fact, this is true for most of the Asian tigers, Asian economies. So this is correct, this is not correct. For a long time, Vietnam's low labor cost and stable exchange rates have attracted global manufacturers, correct. Vietnam has the most productive e-service sector in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a very strong statement, most productive in the Indo-Pacific region. So Indo-Pacific has countries like Singapore, countries like India, countries like South Korea, right? Countries like Japan. So these countries have far more productive e-service sector compared to Vietnam. So this statement is not correct. So the right answer will be 1, 3, and 4, C. So let's look into the second topic, that is structural deficits in India's healthcare system. And this topic is part of GS paper 2 social issues, where we have to study health, education, and skill development. Okay, so this news is based on an analysis that was published in today's The Hindu, right? So here the author has challenged the developmental model of India, especially in terms of healthcare, and has provided certain arguments with respect to the structural challenges of India's healthcare system. So first, let's take a look about the context. The context is about setting up of various medical colleges. So India has approved 43 new medical colleges and more than 20,000 additional MBBS and PG seats. So this appears to be a good news, right? Because we have created extra seats, extra colleges. So in a way that will create more doctors. It will improve India's doctor-patient ratio. But if you analyze it deeply, then you'll identify that this news is masking the greater reality or the larger reality, which is the fact that the rural CHCs still face persistent gaps in the public healthcare delivery. So basically the rural areas, right, community health centers, they do not have the capacity to absorb, or they do not get the specialists that they require. And because of that, there is problem in the entire health industry or the healthcare part, especially at the rural and the developing areas, or in the areas such as the tribal areas and the other excluded areas, aspirational districts. Okay, so that is the thing. And the author has identified 3 major areas with this approach. So first, the author in this article has mentioned that India's health governance is largely focused on creating more and more colleges and creating more and more seats for admission. But the fact that the seats are not translating into the urban-rural divide. So it is not creating a problem or change in the urban-rural gap in terms of the specialist of healthcare. So largely the seats that are created are filled by those who want to join the hospitals at the urban level, right? So what are the problems? First is that there is acute shortages of specialists. So the rural community health centers face nearly 80% shortages of the specialists, and only 4,413 specialists are available against the requirement of more than 21,000, right? So this is a huge number that is not being able to met, right? So because of the lack of specialists, there is problem at the rural healthcare level, and because of that there is out of pocket expenditure that continues to expand, right? And it also impacts the health equity goals that we have the goal of health for all, universal healthcare, which is not being able to met because of this fact. The second problem is about weak health governance framework. So out of the 43 newly approved medical colleges, the most of these medical colleges are private based. So there are 27 are private institutions, and these institutions have a very high capitation fees, and they have very limited accountability towards public health outcome. Because of that, it doesn't amount to any further changes at the ground level. It exacerbates the urban rural divide, right? The third is that reluctance of doctors to serve in the rural areas. So the newly graduated specialists also do not want to work in remote and in the underserved areas. And this can be because of various reasons. This is because of lack of infrastructure. There's no proper facilities in terms of the infrastructure at the various health sector. Then the problem is about basic necessities are also not present. So because of that, and plus there is problem of career advancement. So all of this reason basically doesn't attract the rural areas for the newly graduated students. Then flawed budgetary priorities, where the central budget heavily prioritizes capital expenditure in terms of creation of colleges, creation of AIIMS, etc. Essentially, it is about creation of brick and mortar structure without ensuring that the ecosystem of healthcare professionals, specialists should also be required, because without the specialists, without doctors, just by creating buildings, you cannot solve the problem of health governance in the country, right? So these are largely the four major challenges that the author has identified with the present governance structure of the country. Now, what could be some of the potential solution to this problem? See, ultimately, it has to be created through some incentives. The government needs to create certain incentives through which the newly graduate specialist would come to the rural areas, to the underserved areas, and would continue to do that. Now, for that, there are a couple of things that can be done. We need to first align the PG or the postgraduate medical education with public health needs. So whatever public health needs are, we need to align the subject, the syllabus, the education in line with that need. We need to link postgraduate medical admission and specialist training with vacancy in CHC, right? So, and we need to ensure that the aspirant doctors, those who want to join as medical professional or as a doctor, they should sign an undertaking that they would be serving in underserved areas or in aspirational district at the CHC level for at least 5 years or 10 years. So some sort of undertaking must be spent, especially from, not just from the government studied or government hospitals owned doctors, but also the private doctors as well. Then we should promote rural specialist deployment through financial incentives. What we can do is we can classify these CHC, the community health center, into various categories in terms of difficult, very difficult, something like that. And we should provide some financial incentive. For example, those who serve in the Naxal affected area, they will be getting more financial package, they will be getting more recognition, something like that. Housing facility should be provided, education, quality education, career progression benefits for doctors serving in difficult and remote areas. And then we should be adopting what is called as all or none deployment strategy. See, in the CHC, mostly what happens is largely the government's approach is that they would send 1 or 2 specialists in a CHC. But the problem is that you require at least 5 specialists to work there. You require a team of 5 specialists, then only a CHC would be able to function properly. You require a pediatrician, you require a gynecologist, you require a tiny team of 5 specialists. And therefore, the idea is that the government should be sending a team, and it should be looked at as an ecosystem, not just as an individual initiative. So this is about the challenges that they have mentioned. Now you may be wondering what exactly is CHC. Okay, so for this you should just understand the basic health governance of the country. So health governance essentially is divided into 3 levels: primary level, then it is at the secondary level, and there is tertiary. So at the primary level you have sub-centers or primary health center. Their role is preventive healthcare. So basically they focus on vaccination, they focus on diagnosis of problems, they also focus on maternal health, etc. Right? So this is what is the most visible aspect of the government or the healthcare governance, right? And this is essentially to be promoted by a policy called as National Health Policy, NHP. Now, what is secondary sector here? So secondary wing will be basically where this is CHC, Community Health Center. So CHC will be part of the secondary sector, where you have or the district hospital, which is essentially the first line of referral. So here some minor treatment can be, or routine treatment can be done, specialist can be here, and they can ensure. So if there is a robust CHC or community health center, it would ensure that people do not have to go beyond their district for treatment of certain commonly observed diseases. But for the highly specialized diseases and for some diseases which require a lot of instrument and lot of quality products or quality care, you have tertiary sector. And in tertiary care you have the medical education, medical institutions, specialized or specialties, hospitals, etc. So this is largely for cancer treatment or for or for the neuroplast, something like very specific or very specialized treatment is provided here, including the all such important treatment which is very specialized in nature. It is provided at the tertiary healthcare. Now, what the author is saying, the primary function or the primary emphasis of the government has been either on this or on this. This part has been, this is a missing middle part. The CHC part has not been given that much emphasis, and this is what the government needs to work upon through these measures. Next part is, what are the initiatives taken to strengthen the health system? Now, when we are talking about health system, we are talking about the primary sector, we are talking about the primary level, the secondary level, and also at the tertiary level. So any measure that you can think of could be written as part of the health system. So first is with respect to human resource development, with respect to expansion of AIIMS. So I think around 18 AIIMS have now been created, medical colleges, nursing institutions have been created. Digital health reform in terms of Ayushman Bharat digital mission for digital health IDs and electronic health records. Then affordable healthcare initiative through Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, and this is supposed to reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure. Then public health and preventive health, as we have discussed earlier, about using the National Health Mission to promote the rural and the urban healthcare system. Then with respect to governance and regulatory reforms, National Medical Commission reforms have been taken up to improve the transparency and quality in medical education. Okay, fine. So from this topic, UPSC has asked a lot of questions with respect to health. Okay, and since this part is about the, like, they can ask you a question with respect to a generic question can be asked with respect to the public healthcare system in the country, or they can ask you specific question with respect to the primary level, at the secondary level, or at the tertiary level. So this question was, appropriate local community level healthcare intervention is a prerequisite to achieve health for all in India, explained. So again, here you have to mention the 3 tier of health system in India, and you have to mention how and what are the objective, and then you have to mention what is the importance of the community level healthcare, right? Next topic is about NCRB report. It has released a report called Crimes in India 2024 report. And this report or this topic will be part of GS paper 2, social issues. And it can also be like, some of its data can be used as part of GS paper 1, Indian society as well. So the major change or the major report highlight of this report was that overall crime saw a decline of 6%, which is a good news. But at the same time, the nature of crime or offensive have changed. So as of now, the cyber offenses have rose by 18% in 2024. So a couple of things before we proceed. What is NCRB? NCRB is National Crime Record Bureau, right? So it essentially it functions within Ministry of Health in India, Ministry of Home Affairs in India. And largely what exactly are the functions of NCRB? It is supposed to provide crime statistics in India. As pursuant to this goal, it releases 3 reports. One is the Crime in India report. So this is an annual report and it is published every year. It tells you the trend of crime in India, which people or which stakeholder are the major recipients of the crime in India, where the crime is happening, in which areas it is happening. So it provides a comprehensive analysis of the crime in India. So this also provides or allows the government to take evidence-based policy making. Okay, so it allows government to understand where crime is happening, and then it can take preventive measures. The second important report that NCRB releases is about the prison in India report. So it talks about the prison statistics, about the status of the prisons in India, etc. And third, it talks about accidental death and suicide in India. So these are the 3 reports that it publishes. And now it has also been very important with respect to initiatives like CCTNS, that is Crime and Criminal Tracking Network System. So let us take a look into the key highlights of the report. So first is, as we discussed earlier, that the crime rate has reduced. Crime rate has reduced by 6%. So what do we mean by crime rate? Crime rate means number of crimes committed per 1 lakh population. Okay, so this has dropped from 418.9 per lakh to this from 448.3. Again, you don't need to know the exact data, just this percentage decline would be good enough. Then crimes against the vulnerable groups. With respect to women, it has decreased by 1.5 percentage point. And now the largest share remains crimes cruelty by husband. Okay. And a new category called offenses against women and child was introduced under the BNS. With children, the crimes have increased by 5.9%. And mostly those crimes are with respect to abduction of children or kidnapping of children. In fact, there is around 90,000 plus children have been kidnapped or abducted. They are the missing children. Okay. Then senior citizens rise of around 17%, 16.9% over 2023. So the crimes against senior citizens are increasing. And what are the major common offenses? Theft and fraud, the most common offenses against the senior citizens. With respect to scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, the crimes have decreased. And the more decrease is with respect to scheduled tribes, where the crimes have reduced by 23.1%. And with respect to scheduled caste, it has decreased by 3.6%. Now remember, UPSC is not going to ask you directly the data here. What they will ask you, account for the changes, right? It can ask you, discuss the reason why the crimes against scheduled tribe or scheduled caste have decreased. Or they can ask you, discuss the reason why crimes against senior citizens are increasing. Okay, so you have to find out some of the reasons, the vulnerabilities that they face. So with respect to senior citizen, you can see that here fraud is increasing. And you also know that cyber crime is also increasing. So senior citizens are not very well, generally they are not very well versed with the computer applications. So they are prone to make mistakes here, and therefore fraud generally is targeted towards the senior citizens, especially in the digital realm, right? So you have to construct argument like this. Then specific crime categories with respect to cyber crimes, it has surged by almost 18%, with fraud accounting for nearly 73% of the incident. So this is how the nature of crime is in changing. So earlier, more and more robberies were conducted or theft was conducted, but now this theft, physical theft, is now changed to digital theft. Okay. Then economic offenses have increased by 4.6%, dominated by forgery, cheating, and fraud. Juveniles in conflict with the law increased by 11.2%. Now, to what extent this can be attributed to use of social media? Again, this can be a potential question. With the vast majority, 77.7%, falling in the 16 to 18 age bracket. Okay, a major development. Fine. Now let's take a look about NCRB. We have already discussed. It was established in 1986, and on whose recommendation? Tandon Committee, National Police Commission, and MHA's task force. Then what is the function? It functions as a central repository of information on crime and criminals to assist investigation in linking crimes to perpetrators. What are the major initiatives? First, we have discussed CCTNS, that was initiated in 2009. It has connected 15,000 police stations across India. So anytime digital crime happens or any crime happens, all the police stations have the database linked to each other. Then National Digital Police Portal 2017, police can search criminal suspects on CCTNS and citizen can file online complaints, right? And verify tenants, etc. Key databases that it provides is National Database of Sexual Offenders, that is NDSO, Online Cyber Crime Reporting Portal. Specialized tools include CyTrain, that is training portal for cybercrime investigation, then CRI-MAC, that is the Crime Multi-Agency Center, that is to promote inter-agency coordination. Then what are the other publications we have discussed? Other accidental deaths and suicide in India, prison statistics in India. Other portals managed by NCRB is Central Fingerprint Bureau and NAFIS. Now here UPSC had asked a question based on the NCRB data earlier, and that was about explain why suicide among young women is increasing in India. So we have discussed here earlier as well that the major reason why the major grounds of crime against women is cruelty by the husbands, right? So you can mention or you can extract more points like this by reading this report. Okay. Next news is on EAC of PM, that is the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister has released a paper, and it has proposed a change or overhaul of India's priority sector lending platform or framework, right? And this paper entitled The Economic Impact Analysis of Priority Sector Lending was released by this EAC, and it has highlighted what are the challenges with the existing priority sector lending framework and what needs to be done to replace it or to make it more effective. So this is part of GS paper 3 economy, because priority sector lending is part of banking sector. So first let's understand what has been the challenge with the current framework. So by the way, what is priority sector lending? In very simple term, priority sector lending is an initiative by government and RBI. So what is this initiative? It seeks to provide certain money, certain credit to the priority sector as identified by the government and RBI. And these priority sector can be the MSMEs, agriculture, self-help group, etc. Okay. So from time to time, the government releases report or releases the beneficiary or the recipient, that would be the PSL. So first, let's understand what exactly are the challenges. So first is bank performance gap. So private banks are not able to provide the 40% target. So as per the priority sector framework, the banks are supposed to provide 40% of the credit to the priority sector, right, such as MSMEs, such as the agriculture sector, etc. But the private sector are not able to meet this target, and they rely heavily on the indirect mechanism like the priority sector lending certificates. So they can buy certificates from certain banks instead of giving directly to the priority sector groups. Okay, but they are not able to do that because of various reasons, administrative reason, etc. Then economic efficiency trade-off. this mandated lending reduces total factor productivity because the capital is not reaching the most efficient area, but it is reaching to that area that is artificially created by the government, right? So this encourages capital hoarding, which means that the banks will rather keep that asset with itself rather than lending it to the vulnerable group, because it understands that perhaps if it lends it back, then it may lead to a non-profit or non-performing asset and finances lower yield projects. The PSL portfolios also face high administrative cost because you have to verify whether the person you are giving to is actually a member of MSME or is it deserving or not. So there are a lot of administrative things that are associated with PSL. Then it leads to elevated default risk, NPAs rise. It can also be attributed to this. It also lead to limited growth impact. So various reports at the district level has suggested that there is very limited effect on the economic output. There's no substantial impact here. And it is also geographically very not properly distributed, where the less than 10% of the district, they account for 40% of the total priority sector lending. And these 10% districts are already somewhat comparatively developed. They're in the southern region, they're in the western region. So they occupy or they account for over 45% of the total priority sector advances or loans. So these are the major challenges with the existing framework. Now, what the EAC-PM has suggested with respect to the changes, first is that we need to shift to social equity focus. So first he says, the Economic Advisory Committee says that we should abandon the idea that priority sector lending is going to have some substantial economic gain. Instead, we should look at it as a social initiative, right? And we should ensure that the legacy categories should be excluded, such as corporate farmers. We should strictly target the small and marginal farmers, those farmers which have land holding less than 5 hectares. Then we should target the micro enterprises and not the small enterprises or the medium enterprises. So in the MSME, there's a huge category, right? So a micro, again, it can be classified in terms of the investment or in terms of the revenues. So micro enterprises should be given loans instead of the small and medium enterprises. Then weaker sections such as the SHGs or the small farmers should be also given loans. Then we should lower the overall target for greater bank flexibility. Maybe we can reduce it to 30% or 25%. Holistic approach in terms of we should avoid pure top-down credit mandates in lagging areas which are inefficient, and we should pair the targeted credit with fiscal interventions. And largely we should be addressing the core constraints such as infrastructure skills and market link skills. So what the EAC-PM has been suggesting is that this is not a panacea for the development of the underserved area. We need to ensure that yes, we should be providing them funds, but at the same time, efforts must be taken in order to improve the infrastructure, in order to improve the skills and market linkages. So all these measures should be taken together. Fine, so let's take a look into the PSL framework in India. So as we have already discussed, PSL is an initiative by the RBI that mandates banks to allocate a specific portion of their lending to priority sectors. Now, what are priority sectors? It means that those sectors which government and RBI consider important for the country's development and remain underserved. So they remain underserved because of various reasons such as information asymmetry. Though MSMEs do not know where to get money from, or they have problem with the following all the compliances. Secondly, preference of banks to lend to larger firms. And the reason is administrative simplicity, right? Because the larger firms will have better process, they will understand the requirements well. So they tend to give loans to the larger firm instead of the priority sector or the vulnerable section. Thirdly, there has been a deep-rooted social or caste biases as well. So this is going to address that. What are the categories under priority sector? You have agriculture, micro, small and medium enterprises, export credit, education, housing, social infrastructure, renewable energy, others, right? Then credit targets for domestic commercial banks and foreign banks is 40%. Small finance bank and urban cooperative bank 60%. So this is higher for different banks. It is different for the private banks, domestic commercial bank and foreign bank. It is 40%. Again, here you have to look at that foreign banks with more than 20% branches. Regional rural bank 75%. So RRB has the most or highest target as far as PSL is concerned. This can be part of your prelims exam. Status of credit, it has rose 85% to 42 lakh crore from 23 lakh crore in 2019. So it has increased substantially. Now in UPSC had asked 2 questions from this topic in the past at the prelims level. First was a very simple question. Priority sector lending by banks in India constitute lending to: A is agriculture, B micro and small enterprise, C weaker section, D all of the above. I hope you know the answer to this question. It will be D, all of the above. Then consider the following statement with reference to India. According to MSME Development Act 2006, the medium enterprises are those which investment in plants and machinery between 15 crore and 25 crore. So this is actually lower investment cap is given. It is around 100 crore, something more than that. So this is not correct. This definition was with respect to the small enterprises. So this is not correct. Second, all bank loans to the MSME qualify under the priority sector, which is correct. Okay. So you may be confused that whether it is micro or small or medium. So all of them are part of the priority sector. So here 2 will be correct and the right answer is B. Okay. Fine. So let's now move to place and news, where we are covering Algeria. And recently, India and Algeria Joint Commission has agreed to further the defense cooperation. So you can see that Algeria shares border, or it is in the Mediterranean Sea, facing the Mediterranean Sea, and it is very important area because it has this its geographical features and its political features. So let's take a look into the political features. First, it is located in the Maghreb region of North Africa. So Algeria is part of North Africa, okay, and Algeria is part of what is called as Maghreb region. Maghreb in Arabic means west. So you can see here that it is towards facing the western nations such as European countries and the Mediterranean Sea. And this region comprises the Atlas Mountains and coastal plains of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. These are the Maghreb region. Land boundary: Tunisia, you have Tunisia, then Morocco, then Libya, then Niger, then Mali, and Mauritania. All of them are, and Western Sahara, right? Maritime boundary with Mediterranean Sea. What are the geographical features? Landscape is dominated by high plateaus and Sahara Desert, especially in in this region, with Atlas Mountain is in the north and Ahaggar Massif in the southeast. The climate is Mediterranean climate towards the north and desert type in the south, which is very much like predictable if you look at the geography. So UPSC in the past have also asked question with respect to Sahel region. Now tell me in the comment section, what do you understand by Sahel region? So this is Maghreb region, okay? Now let's discuss quick updates. First is about geocells. Now why this was in news? Because CSIR, CRRI and BPCL, they have received recognition from India Book of Records and the Asia Book of Records for constructing first roadblock section using technical textile geocell made from the end of life plastic waste. So basically what they have done is they have utilized plastic waste and made geocell, technical textile geocell, and that is why they have got this award. So we need to understand what exactly is geocell and why they are important. So geocells are three-dimensional honeycomb-like cellular structures. They are widely application used in embankments, river channel, retaining walls, airport runways, and urban green infrastructure. And they provide improved slope stability, prevent erosion and landslides, reduce construction cost and material use, and enhance road durability. Moreover, they also promote what is called as circular economy, right? So they are using the waste product and utilizing back in the economy. So this is again an example of circular economy. Next is Atomic Energy Regulatory Board. Now, AERB has allowed major equipment installation at Unit 5 and 6 of the Kudankulan nuclear power point. So Kudankulan nuclear power point is India's largest nuclear power point, which have been established with Russian support, right? And it is largely governed by the Nuclear Power Corporation of India. Now, what exactly is Atomic Energy Regulatory Board? It was established by President in 1983 as per the provision of the Atomic Energy Act. So initially, it was not a statutory body. It was established from this act as part of presidential order. But later, via the Shanti Act, 2025, it has granted it statutory status. So if somebody asks you what is the status of AERB, is it a statutory body or a non-statutory body, you can say that it is a statutory body under the Shanti Act. And this act has provided or defined the regulatory powers of AERB, enforcement authority, and it has also provided greater institutional autonomy to AERB. What exactly is the mission of AERB? It is to ensure the use of ionizing radiation and nuclear energy in India does not cause undue risk to the health of people and environment. So basically, it is supposed to ensure that the nuclear energy that is used in India is done in a safe manner. It does not impact either human health or it does not create problem for the environment. Swasth Bharat portal, next news. It was recently launched by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So what is Swasth Bharat portal? So we were earlier talking about the digital governance system, and there we talked about Ayushman Bharat digital mission, which is about providing unique digital IDs to different people, right? So here we have different sort of IDs interspersed with scattered towards different areas. So the idea of Shanti Swasth Bharat portal is to function as a unified digital layer that integrates existing standalone program system, right? So different digital IDs or digital health records are scattered. So here under the Swasth Bharat portal, everything will be unified together. And it is ABDM compliant. So it is compliant with the features of Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission. And it would empower the frontline workers like ASHA, because the ASHA workers are already overburdened. And moreover, they also have to make a record of the digital status of various people, or the health status of various people who are staying somewhere. So by using this framework, Swasth Bharat portal, their administrative work can be reduced and they can largely focus on their actual work. What exactly is Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission? Its objective is to develop a digital backbone to support the integrated health infrastructure and bridging gaps among stakeholders in India's healthcare ecosystem. So essentially it is a digital backbone, okay? Type, it is central sector scheme, tenure is 5 years, and the implementing agency is National Health Authority. Next news is about fair and remunerative price, where the Union Cabinet has raised the FRP by rupees 10 per quintal for the sugarcane, right? So MSP, the minimum support price is for certain crops, but the MSP for sugarcane is called as FRP, right? So that is FRP. And FRP is the minimum price declared by the central government at which the sugar mills, so here government does not procure it, but the sugar mills procure it, and they're legally bound to procure sugarcane from the farmers. The legal basis is Sugarcane Control Order 1966. So it is not by any legal mechanism. It is through a presidential or a government order. Institutional mechanism recommended by the CACP, that is Commission for Agricultural Cost and Price. The same CACP is also responsible for MSP as well, for determining the MSP. Then, and it should be approved by the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs. What is the criteria? It is not based on any random method. It is based on various criteria such as production cost, sugar recovery rate, alternative crop returns, byproduct value, and consumer interest, etc. Apart from the FRP, there's another concept called state advice price. So some states like Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Haryana, Uttarakhand, they provide SAP, which is generally higher than FRP, right? So they tell their sugar or the sugar mills to buy it from a higher price compared to the FRP, right? Next is about India EU Trade and Technology Council, TTC. And why this was in news? Because recently India and EU has launched this 15.2 million euro project, that is about 169 crore joint initiative. And the idea here is to strengthen the EV battery recycling, right? And this EV recycling essentially is to ensure that all the important components, raw materials that are used for the EV battery cycle, such as lithium, cobalt, etc., can be recovered and it could be utilized again for the production process. And this initiative will be funded through EU's Horizon Europe program and India's Ministry of Heavy Industries. What exactly is this India EU Trade and Technology Council? It was launched in February 2023, so it's a relatively new council. Objective is to push both regions towards strategic autonomy by actively reducing EU's dependence on China and India's reliance on Russia, right? So it's a very important pillar of India-EU relation. Sulfur dioxide. So recently IIT Delhi has published a report, and it had said that if we are able to control SO2 emissions, then approximately 1,24,564 deaths every year can be minimized or can be fully mitigated. Now, what exactly here we need to understand about SO2? Okay, so SO2 is a colorless toxic gas with a pungent choking odor, just like rotting eggs. Its role in secondary pollutant, SO2 reacts in atmosphere to form secondary inorganic aerosol, which are suspended in the environment, including sulfate, nitrate, and ammonium. Now, the problem here is that these pollutants add to PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 are finely thinly particulate matter that are linked to various diseases like heart diseases, lung diseases, etc. It is a pollutant. So SO2 is a pollutant monitored under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, notified by the Central Pollution Control Board. Now tell me which other pollutants are also under NAAQS. This was part of UPSC PYQ. What are the major sources of SO2? Coal-fired power plants, which is the largest source of SO2. Apart from that, smelting metallic ores, petroleum refinery, volcanic eruptions, and emissions from transportation. Next news is about Project Mausam, where Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology has established a state-of-art urban testbed and aerosol observatory at the SRM Institute of Science and Technology in Chennai under Mission Mausam. So what exactly is Mission Mausam? So Mission Mausam essentially is about some sort of providing infrastructure, improvement of infrastructure with respect to disaster management. Okay, so for disaster management, we require different interventions at the pre-disaster level, at the post-disaster level, and also during the disaster level, okay, during the disaster. So when you start upgrading the infrastructure with respect to, say, the emergency alert system or cyclone early warning system, they would be fallen under the project, under the Mission Mausam. Okay, so it was launched in 2024 under Ministry of Earth Sciences, not under the Ministry of Home Affairs, but Ministry of Earth Sciences. The implementing agency is Indian Meteorological Department, the National Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and IITM. The budget is 2,000 crore over 2 years. What is the aim? To make the nation weather ready and climate smart. Second, to improve weather and climate services, ensuring timely and precise observation, modeling and forecasting information for multiple sectors. And these sectors can be agriculture, disaster management, and rural development. Fine. So this is all about news today. I hope this was good. Please revise, and all the best. Thank you.